Welcome back, viewers. In this segment of The Scope, we'll be discussing France and the protests there. Now, though the French government has now postponed its fuel taxes for 6 months, it seems this has not been enough to appease protesters. Students and police unions, among others, have now joined the movement for their own reasons. For what are being foreseen as France's biggest demonstrations, possibly this weekend, armored vehicles and even the military have been seen to be brought in. Let's discuss this further now with our first guest. Joining us to discuss this further, we're joined by Meguerditchian, who is a journalist joining us from France. He is in the French capital, Paris. Van, thank you for joining us. What do you make, firstly, of the protests as they begun? And secondly, the fact that the French government, even postponing these taxes, hasn't necessarily appeased everybody.
Thanks for having me, Waqar. Just to begin with, just as a reminder, we're just one day away from what is expected to be one of the biggest rallies that France will see in the past has seen in the past 4 weeks now. Listen, there is a major lack of understanding between the French and their government. There is a big divide at the moment between the protesters and what the government stands. What we're seeing now is all the unions that in the past they used to lead the protests and have been so far silent, so far on the sidelines. They are joining the protests right now. They are joining the protests, nationwide protests in major cities in France as of this week. The farmers, the police, the major labor unions are joining these protests, and they are promising that they will rally side by side with other activists around the country. But there is still a sense of uncertainty as of whether there might be some kind of a deal, there might be some kind of an agreement this evening to avoid this big rally that is announced tomorrow. The government has not given a green light for this rally, and they have been preparing now. They have been sending in bigger enforcements, bigger number of policemen to make sure that violence doesn't get out of control.
All right, so Van, as we've been discussing so far, we've discussed firstly the issue of these protests to begin with, but Macron came into office, Van, with a promise to reform the state finances. This goes back to what is being seen as the poor management of state finances by Hollande. Does he have a fair point, do you think?
It is correct. It is correct. It is right. And to give Macron, to give the president credit, there are deep-rooted problems in France, and the country's economy needs reforms. And it's been years now that the country is suffering from the lack of reforms here in the country. And the issue is that he promised these reforms. He promised that he would open up the economy. He promised that he would modernize the French economy, and in a way help the country fight this endemic unemployment that has been on the European level. It has been something really symbolic of France. This unemployment that keeps dragging on. This big rate of unemployment keeps dragging on. And he has promised. He promised during the campaign that he would do things that would, improve the standard of living of the French people, and it would improve the purchasing power of the French. But what the French are coming to see, that not a lot of changes are taking place, but the changes are coming mainly in a way that the other past governments have done, adding more taxes, more burdens on the French, promising get rid of one tax, but instead introducing two other taxes. And so the French are feeling that they are being cheated, and there is a complete lack of trust today. But still, your viewers should know the country is divided. The president has its supporters. The president's movement, La République en Marche, is still popular, and on many points, the president's supporters are coming out in defense of the president, and we still have to hear from the president. We have only heard from the prime minister so far.
Okay, so I know that you've reported from on the ground when it comes to these yellow vest protest vans. So tell us about what you've observed, because there is a lot of concern, or there has been some concern, I should say, online about the violence that has been seen on the part of some of these protesters. What can you tell us about that?
Look, there are 2 points on this. There are clearly people who intentionally would like to cause violence during protests. Any protest that gets as big in number is prone to go into some sort of violence. But the other point is, it seems that in the past month, we don't have any instance where people would like to peacefully protest, rally, and then there won't be any clash with the police. There is, on every occasion, we have not seen in a Western European country this year that you have protests and that it ends peacefully, and the police make sure that the protests run peacefully. The police usually tend to protect these protesters and make sure the demonstration goes peacefully. What we've seen in the past month, every time there is a protest, we are seeing violence. Every time there is a protest, we are seeing fires. Every time, it is true, there might be a lot of protesters who would like to cause in the wake of the chaos, in the wake of in the movement, people would cause violence. But there seems to be a lack of coordination on the police as well. Both sides are to be blamed on this. The police are supposed to be protecting these protesters. The college students, high school students have been protesting for the past 3 days. 150 schools around the country, at least, have been closed for the past 2 days. It is not clear what will happen this morning in France, but at least 100 students between the ages of 15 and 17 have been arrested on the outskirts and inside Paris yesterday. And we've seen images coming to us on video, being videotaping students who are on their knees, hands on their backs, surrounded by policemen. The French have not seen scenes like these since 1968.
I wonder, because you've been on the ground, you've observed these protesters and these protests from up close. I wonder what you make of the fact that it does seem like a lot of these different groupings who are part of this protest movement. As you mentioned, the students, now we have both high school students, university, college students, and we earlier had different trade unions, etc., also joining this movement. They all seem to have different goals in mind. They have different grievances with the government. With the fact that doesn't have a leader as such, this entire movement, is there any chance for, if I may use the word, success in what they want to achieve?
Yes, that's a very good question, Waqar. So there are 3 points here, if I'm following. The first point is the media in the country, as journalists and everybody else, everybody is trying to understand who is the leader of this movement. There is no one leader of this movement. There are a few people on social media who have been very active from the first day of the gatherings on the highways, people wearing yellow vests to protest. There are no leaders. This is a leaderless movement. It is a gathering of different groups and from different parts of the country, just random people gathering in villages and towns and talking about what all the way in Pakistan, all the way in India, all the way in Iraq, people are associating themselves with. People are understanding that there is a lack of understanding between governments and citizens. These continuous measures of imposing new taxes while the world is still going through a slow growth on the sense of the economy, and the economy is not getting better in these countries. And then you see governments, instead of like helping out these towns, these villages, there is more pressure to regulate the economy, to impose taxes, to basically impose a certain agenda that people do not see is helping them. The second point is you have violent people. You have people from different political backgrounds coming into these demonstrations. You have the far left, you have the far right, you have right extremists, leftist extremists. You have different political parties. You have the president's political movement, En Marche, is in complete control of the French Parliament and the presidency, and controls the government, of course, through the prime minister. And then you have the opposition, which is made out of essentially three major parties, which are the far right, the National Assembly. You have the traditional establishment party, Les Républicains, and then you have the far left party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which is strongly in the past few days joined these protests. So even in this political alliance, to support this protest, there is no agreement. But viewers should understand that in these kind of movements, we don't really need to agree between each other on major political ideologies. What makes this movement strong today, nationwide, is that people from different political ideologies can agree on certain issues that relate to them, relate to their everyday lives. And this is what is making this movement strong. Now, the third point I wanted to come to is the president has stayed silent. The president thinks that this is just a normal state of affairs in France, and this will come and go because there is no leadership. People have anger, they're angry, they're expressing themselves, and this will come and go. This might be a good strategy. We'll have to wait and see.
All right, Van, so I know you have a busy schedule, so I'll give you one last question, if I may. What do you think this means for Europe as a whole? Because right now we know that Merkel is on her way out in Germany, and she's obviously an extremely important figure for Europe. France is an extremely important player within Europe as well. And as you mentioned in your answer, we are seeing protests like this. We have seen protests like this across not just Europe, but across the world, of course, for differing reasons. What does this mean for Europe as a whole at this point?
This should be a wake-up call for Europe. Look, there might be a lot of European countries that are faring a little bit better economically than what France is going through. But look, I was speaking to an Iraqi friend yesterday. There are abrupt, spontaneous protests starting in different parts of Iraq. People wearing yellow vests. Iraqis are wearing yellow vests and protesting against their government, against the living standards and the conditions there. This goes while this goes beyond Europe, but the issue stays about Europe. President Macron made his presidency from the start about Europe. He chose to walk into his victory speech with the European national anthem. He chose European values and European battles, European issues over the issues of the rural side of France, over the issues that the French cities and the French people are suffering from. He had a bigger vision. He has a bigger vision that might prove to be right on the long term. But today the French are feeling, and in different parts of Europe, you have UK, you have Germany. There is anger that their governments are being tied up, are being too distracted by European issues, and they're ignoring what is going on in their countries. This has been with us for quite a few years now, and I don't think it will go away. If the Europeans don't listen to this, these kind of protests, these kind of movements, which are literally populist movements, gathering different people from all sides, this might carry on itself to prove decisive in different parts of the European continent.
Very well, Van. We'll leave it there at that, but of course we appreciate you taking your time out to share your insight with us. That was Van Meguerditchian speaking to us live from Paris in France. He's a journalist who is based there. We of course appreciate the insight that he provided for us. As he was talking about there, of course, just before we go into this short break, Van spoke a lot about, of course, the fact that this will, of course, have an effect going forward on French society as well. As we know, of course, President Macron came into office with a lot of promises in place, and we'll have to wait and see whether he delivers on those going forward. He has not yet, of course, delivered on a lot of those promises. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing to discuss the ongoing protest, the Yellow Vest protest, I should say, in France. To discuss this issue further, we're now joined by Mr. David Andelman, who is a journalist, commentator, and author. And he's joining us live now from France itself. David, thanks for joining us. What do you make, David, at this point in time when it comes to these protests? I was reading an interesting poll which has come out, the Harris Interactive poll, and it says that 72% of French support these Yellow Vest protests, but obviously they contextualize the protests by saying that 85% of the French, though, do not support any violence. But 72% is quite a large number, isn't it?
Well, it is, but you have to look at exactly what that means. First of all, in terms of the violence, yes, everybody is afraid. You know, it's interesting. I used this in my column in Reuters yesterday. My cheese shop owner, who is she's had this cheese shop for almost 5 decades, running around the corner from me in Paris, and we're very close to the National Assembly. And she told me yesterday in 47 years in business, she has never been so afraid. And she has been through the protests of 1968, where barricades went up all over France, all over Paris. Certainly, many of them set on fire, as they have been in the last several weeks. But she was never so afraid as now. And it's true. It really does seem that the forces of order, law and order, have just lost control of the entire situation. And we'll have to see this Saturday, whether that continues. That said, French people don't like to be taxed. Well, who does? But it's even more to the point that this is the situation. Macron came in with what he thought was a very large mandate to completely change the French system in so many ways. And the fact is that some of the French kind of like that idea. They like the idea of change, except when it comes home and it begins to affect them personally. So this is what's happened. He's made all of these changes, all of which may, in fact, find very, very important results.
So, David, the argument about Macron has been that he is a president of the elite, of the rich, right? I'm sure you've heard that term used a lot in France itself. People would say that, the high taxes are not translating into public services, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that point, but they would also then cite things like, tax breaks for the rich. Does that, do you think, or a wealth tax, pardon me, the scrapping of the wealth tax for the rich and the tax breaks for business, does that sound like a president of the rich?
Well, it may sound like that, but if you really listen to what he's saying, it makes a lot of sense for just about everyone. Look, I was here in the 1980s when François Mitterrand, the socialist president, the first socialist president of France, in fact, under the Fifth Republic, when he started this wealth tax, and everybody was horrified by it. People were saying, "Oh gosh, does that mean my rowboat is going to be taxed?" If they say it's a yacht. That's the problem. There is no question about that. That was a problem then. But in the 30 years since that tax came into effect, the people began to understand and appreciate it. But what Macron did when he abolished this was very shrewd. He did this largely because he saw that the United Kingdom, Britain, was leaving it's called Brexit, of course, was leaving the European Union. Yeah. When that happened, what he hoped and expected was a lot of the bankers and wealthy corporations and corporate leaders who are based in London would move to France, would move to Paris. And he wanted a lure to bring them here, which would have meant more jobs, more tax revenues for the government, and all of this. And he thought that this was the only real attraction he could have. Otherwise, they might very well go to Brussels, for instance, where the European Union is headquartered. They might go to Germany and so on. So this was an inducement to bring them here. But the French don't see that immediately. They won't see that maybe for several years when all of this actually transpires. So that's the reason why Macron continues, even despite all these protests, to insist this tax had to go. And that's what makes him look like a wealthy person. He was an investment banker. There's no question about that. He was an investment banker before he came into power. He was an anarch, a graduate of the top school in Paris. But virtually every French president in the last half century has been an anarch. So that shouldn't be seen as all that unusual. But that whole question of the wealth tax does have very strong foundations.
All right, so at the very least then, do you think there is a disconnect between the Macron government and the people? Because it does seem like if his intentions were good, then he maybe hasn't sold it well to the people, because when we're looking at his popularity ratings, and not to say that Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande were popular either, quite quickly into their tenures as well. But Macron, as you said, came in seemingly a new face on the horizon. People were excited about what he may present, but that hasn't gone down well. His popularity has also dropped quite drastically.
Well, it has. I mean, you have to understand that Hollande, of course, at the end had single-digit, literally around 8 or 9% popularity rating. So still has a way to go, Macron, before he reaches that, believe it or not. Still, you're right. The big question is, how much of an overwhelming mandate did he have? And if you really look at go back and look at his election figures. The first round of the election, he did not win 50% of the vote. He was one of the top two. So he ran against Marine Le Pen, the extreme right-wing candidate. Now, most French people certainly do not want Marine Le Pen, or even particularly her father before her, ruling France. So that became a real issue for them. So the result was that many simply did not go to the polls in the second round of the election. So Macron really won with barely a majority of the entire country, probably not even a majority of the entire country voting for him. There were so many abstentions in the second round of the voting that you can't really say that he was a hugely majority president, although he certainly overwhelmed Marine Le Pen. And in the parliamentary elections a month or so later, the same thing happened. His party kind of steamrolled everybody else. He got a huge majority in the National Assembly.
Okay, so let's, if we can for a moment, just look at this from a European point of view, because France is obviously an extremely important player within Europe. We now have Angela Merkel, as you well know, stepping away from her position quite soon in Germany. That all means something for Europe, doesn't it? Considering the fact that we also have the far right in many countries across the continent rising to an extent, their support growing in places like Germany. Even in France, Marine Le Pen's numbers, seemingly at least, have gone up according to latest polls. What do you make of that?
Well, there is a right-wing movement in Europe, a populist movement, shall we say. It's been very strong also in Italy. Of course, the Italian right-wing has effectively taken control of the government. It's somewhat unlike the right-wing in a lot of these other countries, which are much more extreme in that respect. Look, Macron has decided from the beginning, when he first came into office, that he wanted to be the new leader of the new Europe. And this is something that he really positioned himself as trying to do. And there was a lot going for that in the very end. There was certainly a lot going for that. As you mentioned, Merkel is on her way out. Her support has been fading, and she's been around for a long time, probably too long a time for a European leader. Theresa May is leaving the continent and so on. So Macron was positioning himself to be the leader of Europe, and that seemed to be a very good idea. Now, all of that is very much up in the air, and the question now becomes, who is going to be the leader of the new Europe, and what country can take the lead? Is he so damaged by all of this that he really can't recover? I'm not persuaded it's gone that far yet, but it could go that far. There's no doubt about it, and so that's a great concern.
Very well, David. We'll leave that as our final word, but of course, appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope and sharing your thoughts with us on this very important topic. That was David Andelman, journalist, commentator, and author, speaking to us live there from France itself via Skype. David, they're mentioning something important at the end, which I think is important to highlight, that Macron came into office thinking that he would be the new leader of Europe. France, no doubt, still an extremely important player within Europe at this point, even as Merkel is on her way out. But will these Yellow Vest protests damage his reputation, damage France's reputation in Europe going forward? We'll have to wait and see how all of this plays out, of course. But that's been me, Waqar Rizvi, for this edition of Scope. Thanks for watching.